Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining me today. My name's Juliet, and today I'm going to walk you through my presentation entitled Keeping Jane Austen Alive, Reading, Writing, and Performing Austen in the Digital Age. So I'd like to begin with a question. Um, if Jane Austen was alive in 2026, do you think she'd have a TikTok account? Now I know that's a slightly absurd image. It's difficult to picture a woman with a quill pen standing in front of a ring light saying, hello everyone, today we're going to expose Mr. Collins. But perhaps the more interesting question isn't whether Austen herself would use social media. It's why more than 200 years after her death, millions of people do to talk about her. Because if you spend any time online recently, you've probably encountered Jane Austen somewhere, perhaps even without realizing it. Maybe you've watched a TikTok edit of Mr. Darcy dramatically walking through the mist, or maybe you've laughed at a Pride and Prejudice meme. Maybe you've stumbled across a Reddit debate or about Emma Woodhouse, or perhaps you've spent just far too long on Wattpad and AO3 reading fan fictions. These aren't isolated examples, they're evidence of something much bigger. Jane Austen may has remained relevant, but more importantly, she has become one of the internet's favorite authors. So today I'd like to explore why, and more specifically, I'd like to argue that Austen's extraordinary longevity is not simply the results of publishers and film adaptations and school curricula. I think it's the result of readers who create, debate, reinterpret, and share her work with others. In other words, um, fans. Through a cover of our own in Wattpad and all the way through TikTok and Reddit and Instagram and also Discord, Austen's word continues to expand more than 2 centuries after the publications of her novels. And as someone who researches Jane Austen, hosts a podcast dedicated to her work, I help co-found the first Jane Austen Society of France. I've had the privilege of experiencing these communities from two perspectives, um, as a scholar, but also first and foremost, actually, as a fan. So for a long time, those identities were often presented as opposites. Scholars often analyzed literature when fans simply loved it. Yet, fan studies has shown us that this distinction is far too simplistic. For example, Henry Jenkins famously argues that fans are not passive consumers but active participants in the creation of meaning. They do not merely read stories, they extend them, they reinterpret them, and they keep them alive. So this brings us to another important point. People sometimes speak as though the internet rescued Jane Austen from obscurity. I don't think it did. Jane Austen never disappeared. Long before social media existed, readers collected her novels, debated her characters, imagined unwritten scenes, and speculated about what happened after the final page. Deirdre Lynch reminds us that the passionate Janeite long predates the digital age. The internet did not invent Austen fandom, it simply made it visible and connected readers across the world. So why Austen? Why has she become such a dominant presence online when so many 19th century writers remain largely confined to classrooms? Part of the answer, I think, lies in her characters. Elizabeth Bennet still feels witty, Emma Woodhouse still feels overconfident, Anne Elliot still understands regret, Mr. Collins remains painfully awkward, and Mrs. Bennet will probably become a parenting influencer. More importantly, Austen's characters feel psychologically real, they're flawed, contradictory, and recognizably human. Readers do not simply admire them, they recognize themselves in them. That emotional identification is often where fandom begins. Another reason, I think, is Austen's extraordinary sense of humor. We sometimes forget just how funny she was. Her novels are built on irony, social embarrassment, awkward conversation, and the gap between what people say and what they really mean, so just basically irony. So in many ways, Austen was already writing the kind of obsessional comedy that flourishes on social media today, and it's perhaps no surprise that her novels have become such fertile grounds for memes, TikTok videos, and online humor. Ultimately, what fascinates me most is that Austen fandom is not simply about consuming stories, it's about creating them too. For example, readers note at Austen, they discuss her novels, they produce podcasts, video essays, fan fiction, artworks, memes, playlists, historical costumes, etc. They even have, entirely new community centers around her work. That creativity is what this presentation is really about. So today I'd like to explore 5 different ways in which online communities engage with Jane Austen. First, we'll look at how readers build communities through platforms such as, Reddit, Discord, Book Talk. Then we move to fanfiction and participatory writing like AO3 and Wattpad. From there, we'll explore memes and digital humor before examining how fans perform Austen through Regency fashion festivals and social media aesthetics. Finally, I'll ask what all of these practices tell us about the survival of literary classics in the digital age. Because I believe that Jane Austen's greatest achievement is not simply that people still read her, is that they continue talking to her, writing with her, laughing with her, building communities around her, and that I think is the clearest sign that classic literature is truly alive. So before discussing fanfictions, memes, or TikTok, I think it's important to begin somewhere much simpler with reading itself. So when we imagine Jane Austen, we often picture, it's a literary activity, perhaps someone sitting in an armchair with a copy of Pride and Prejudice, enjoying the novel in silence. Um, because reading has traditionally been understood as an intimate encounter between one reader and one text. Yet the internet has profoundly transformed that experience. Today, reading Jane Austen is rarely an entirely private activity. Increasingly, it's something that happens collectively. Readers discuss chapter as they read them, recommend editions to one another, debate the morality, of individual characters, compare adaptations, exchange historical information. They even organize virtual reading groups across different countries and time zones. This observation may seem relatively straightforward, but it reflects a significant shift in the way literature functions within contemporary societies and culture. Because rather than thinking of reading as a final stage of literary conception, we might instead understand it as the beginning of an ongoing conversation. The novel no longer ends when the final page is turned. Instead, it continues through discussion, interpretation, disagreement, and shared enthusiasm. The idea lies at the heart of contemporary fan studies. Perhaps no scholar has shaped this film more profoundly that Henry Jenkins, which I've mentioned earlier. In Textual Portraits, Jenkins challenged the traditional image of a fan as a passive consumer or obsessive enthusiast. He instead argued that fans are active participants who produce culture rather than simply consuming it. Reading in this context becomes an interactive practice. Meaning is not transmitted unilaterally from author to reader, but constructed collectively within communities of interpretation. Although Jenkins was primarily discussing television fandoms, his observation translates remarkably well to literary communities, and especially with Austen, because readers rarely finish a novel and simply move on. Instead, they continue thinking about the characters and discussing moral choices and recommending adaptations and comparing interpretations, introducing new readers to Austen's world. This is particularly visible on platforms such as, for example, Reddit or Discord. Um, one of the, you know, Reddit is one of the largest communities online dedicated to Jane Austen, and it consists of thousands of readers who discuss virtually every aspect of her work. The questions range from, straightforward topics like which adaptation should I watch first, to highly sophisticated literary debates concerning narrative irony, free indirect discourse, or the historical accuracy of particular film adaptations. What's particularly striking is the diversity of participants. Professional academics contributes alongside undergraduate students, lifelong readers, but also casual fans who've already only watched like the 2005 Joe Wright adaptation of Pride and Prejudice. Um, you know, some of them are just encountering Austen for the first time, and expertise is therefore distributed across the community rather than concentrated within institutions. This phenomenon recalls Pierre Levy's concept of collective intelligence. Writing at the beginning of the digital age, Levy argued that knowledge increasingly emerges through collaboration rather than individual expertise. So digital communities function as a space where information is constantly pulled, corrected, expanded, and refined. No single participant possesses complete knowledge, yet collectively the community often develops an extraordinarily sophisticated understanding of its subject. And I find this particularly fascinating when observing discussions surrounding Jane Austen, because a reader may ask a seemingly simple question about, entailment in Pride and Prejudice, but within an hour, historians explain, inheritance law, and literary scholars discuss narrative function, and lawyers clarify legal terminology, and then enthusiastic readers recommend secondary sources. What begins as a question about one fictional family um, becomes an interdisciplinary conversation involving, law, literature, and gender studies. So, in this sense, online fandom performs a function remarkably similar to that of the university seminar room. Of course, the discussion differ in tone and methodology, but both spaces are fundamentally organized across around collaborative interpretation. Discord offers another compelling example of this transformation. Unlike Reddit, which primarily organizes asynchronous discussions, Discord enables readers to participate in real-time conversations. Entire servers are devoted to reading Austen chapters by chapters, and participants organize live reading sessions, compare translation, share historical illustrations, recommend scholarly articles, and sometimes they even, occasionally invite researchers to answer questions. The distinction between expert and non-expert becomes increasingly fluid, producing what Matt Hills describes as performative expertise. Sorry. Within fan communities, authority is earned not necessarily through institution affiliation, but through, sustained participation, generosity, and demonstrated knowledge. This observation challenges another assumption about literary authority. Traditionally, literary criticism has often privileged institutional expertise. Universities, journals, conferences have long been considered the principal sites where literary meaning is produced. But digital fandoms complicate this hierarchy by demonstrating that valuable literary interpretation also emerges outside academia. This is not to suggest that every Reddit discussion possesses the same scholarly rigor as peer-reviewed criticism. Rather, it highlights the existence of multiple forms of literacy and literary expertise. Fans frequently possess astonishingly detailed knowledge accumulated through, years of rereading, comparing editions, analyzing adaptations, and participating in community discussions. So their expertise may differ from academic criticism, but it's expertise nonetheless. BookTok provides another fascinating illustration of this phenomenon, because it was initially dismissed by many scholars as superficial or commercially driven, but BookTok has nevertheless become one of the most influential spaces for literary recommendations in recent years. Thousands of short videos introduce new audiences to classic literature, often through highly personal and emotional responses rather than formal literary analysis. And Jane Austen occupies a particularly prominent place within this ecosystem. Videos recommending books that made me believe in love again, or they regularly, virtue persuasion, and, second chance romance lists celebrating strong female leads almost inevitably include, Elizabeth Bennet. At first glance, these videos may appear reductive because reducing complex novels to, 60-second clips inevitably simplifies their argument, but dismissing book talk entirely would overlook its extraordinarily cultural significance. Rita Felsky's uses of literature offers a particularly useful framework here because they argue that readers engage with literature through recognition, enchantment, knowledge, and also shock. And these responses are emotional before they are analytical. Readers often fall in love with books long before they begin interpreting them critically. So, book talk, I would argue, exemplifies this process. Its users rarely begin by discussing, narrative structure or free indirect discourse. Usually, instead, they ask like simpler but equally important questions. Um, which novel made you cry? Which character felt most real? Which romance stayed with you for a year after you finished reading them? Far from trivializing literature, these emotional responses frequently constitute a first step towards deeper engagement. Digital communities, therefore, perform an important mediating function between popular culture and academic culture. They introduce readers to canonical literature while simultaneously encouraging increasingly sophisticated discussion. So, as someone who helped establish the first Jane Austen Society of France, I've observed this dynamic repeatedly. Some members initially joined because they love a film adaptation, others discovered Jane Austen through book talk, YouTube essays, or even memes. Yet, over time, these same readers began attending lectures and reading bibliographies and biographies and exploring historical context and engaging with academic criticism. Popular enthusiasm became intellectual curiosity. Perhaps this should not surprise us because Jane Austen herself understood that reading was never simply about acquiring information. Her novels are filled with conversation about book, taste, interpretation, and moral judgment. So characters recommend novels and misunderstand them and criticize them, etc. Reading for Austen was a profoundly social activity. So the internet has not fundamentally changed that reality. Rather, it's just expanded its scale. Reading, in other words, has become something more than an individual act. It has become a communal practice, and for many readers, the communal experience eventually inspires something even more creative than discussion. It inspires, writing or maybe more, and that's precisely where I would like to turn our attention now. If reading Jane Austen has become a collective activity, then writing Austen represents its natural continuation, I think, because among all the practices that characterize digital fandom, fan fiction is perhaps the more creative and certainly the most misunderstood, I think. For many people outside fan communities, the word still carries a certain stigma. Fan fiction is often imagined as amateur writing, romantic wish fulfillment, or stories of questionable literary quality hidden away in obscure corners of the internet. Yet, this stereotype has increasingly been challenged by scholars over the last 25 years. Rather than dismissing fan fiction as derivative, um, researchers in fan studies have argued that it constitutes one of the richest examples of participatory culture in the digital age. Fan fiction demonstrates that readers do not simply interpret literature, they actively enter into dialogue with it. Brian Thomas offers one of the clearest definitions of fan fiction, describing it as stories produced by fans based on pre-existing characters and narrative works. Although deceptively simple, this definition captures something fundamental. Fan fiction is not simply imitation, it's an act of interpretation, Every decision made by a fine writer, choosing a narrator, changing an ending, modernizing the setting, focusing on a secondary character, reveals a particular reading of the original text. In this sense, writing fan fiction resembles literary criticism more closely than we might initially imagine. Where the literary critic constructs an argument through analysis, the fan fiction author constructs an argument through narrative. Both begin with the same question: what does the text mean? The difference lies only in the method. One writes an essay, the other writes another story. Henry Jenkins famously argued that fans are textual poachers, borrowing Michel de Certeau's metaphor to describe readers who appropriate existing texts and make them their own. Importantly, Jenkins does not understand this appropriation as theft. Rather, it represents creative negotiation between author and reader. Fans inhabit fictional words and have profoundly affected them, and continue those narratives according to their own experiences, identities, and cultural contexts. Jane Austen seems almost uniquely suited to this process. Unlike fantasy novels built upon elaborate world building, Austen's fiction is remarkably open. Her narratives focus less on external events than on human relationships, conversations, misunderstanding, and moral development. These are experiences that remain recognizable across culture and historical periods. Consequently, readers rarely feel that Austen's novels belong exclusively to Regency England. Instead, they are remarkably contemporary questions. For example, what if Elizabeth Bennet lived in London today? What if Anne Elliot had access to social media? What would happen if Charlotte Lucas refused marriage altogether? Each of these questions generates a new story, and more importantly, each question reveals something about the reader asking it. Abigail de Kotnik argues that fanfiction functions as a cultural archive in which communities preserve not only fictional words but also their own emotional investment in those words. Therefore, fanfiction records how readers respond to literature at particular historical moments. Reading Austen fanfiction today, therefore, tells us as much about 21st century readers as it does about Jane Austen herself. This is particularly evident on Archive of Our Own, more commonly known as AO3, which was created by fans and for fans. Unlike commercial publishing platforms, it does not privilege profitability or marketability. Instead, it offers an open archive where writers can freely publish transformating works inspired by literature, film, television, video games, or even historical figures. The terminology used within AO3 itself reveals much about fan culture. Stories are organized not simply by title or genre, but through an elaborate system of tags. Readers can search for enemies to lovers, slow burn, alternate universe, canon divergence, or missing scenes. These categories are more than practical labels, they represent a shared vocabulary developed collectively by fan communities over many years. Interestingly, many of these tropes correspond remarkably well to Austen's own narratives. Enemies to lovers has become almost synonymous with Pride and Prejudice, and slow burn perfectly describes Anne Elliot and Captain Wentworth. And thousands of stories relocate Lizzie and Darcy's in university, hospitals, law firms, coffee shops, political campaigns. Other preserve the Regency setting while imagining conversations Austen never wrote. Some focus on Georgiana Darcy, Charlotte Lucas, Colonel Fitzwilliam, or even Caroline Bingley, allowing secondary figures to occupy center stage. But these choices are not arbitrary. They often respond to what literary theorist Wolfgang Esser famously describes as the gaps within literary text. Because every novel leaves certain questions unanswered, readers naturally attempt to fill these spaces through imagination, and fanfiction simply externalizes that interpretative process. One particularly fascinating development concerns the growing diversity of Austen fanfiction. More contemporary writers explore identities that remain largely absent from Austen novels, not because Austen lacked imagination, but because she wrote within the social and publishing conventions, of 19th century England. Today, readers reimagine queer versions of Emma, artistic interpretation of Anne Elliot, Black Elizabeth Bennet, Muslim Darcys, or transgenders Wentworth, or contemporary diasporic adaptations that relocate Austen's narrative far beyond Britain. These reinterpretations should not necessarily be understood as attempt to correct Austen, but rather they reflect what Linda Hutcheon describes in the theory of adaptation as the continual process of repetition with variation. Some of these reinterpretations eventually move beyond fanfiction platforms altogether, and this is where the boundary between fanfiction and published literature becomes particularly interesting. Several contemporary novels began or strongly resemble the kind of transformative writing traditionally associated with fandom. For example, Joe Baker's Longbourn shift attention away from the Bennet family towards their servant, asking what life looked like below the stairs, while, Darcy and Elizabeth were exchanging witty remarks upstairs. There are other examples, many of them, Ayesha at Last relocates Pride and Prejudice within a contemporary Muslim community in Toronto. There is also Unmarriageable by Sonia Kamal, set in modern Pakistan, exploring how Austen's concerns with class marriage and female autonomy remain strikingly relevant within entirely different cultural contexts. These novels illustrate an important point. Fanfictions should not be viewed merely as amateur precursor to real literature. Rather, it exists on a continuum of adaptation that includes published novels, film adaptations, web series, theatre productions, and contemporary retellings. In fact, one of the most celebrated Austen adaptations of the first 21st century, is the Lizzie Bennet Diaries, and it emerged from precisely this participatory digital culture because it's presented through YouTube vlogs and social media accounts, and it invites readers not simply to watch the story but to interact with it in real time. Characters maintain account and answered audience question and existed simultaneously within fiction and social media, and the boundaries separating adaptations, performance, and participation became increasingly blurred. Roland Barthes famously proclaimed that the death of the author, arguing that meaning ultimately belongs to readers rather than writers. And fanfiction perhaps represent the most visible manifestation of this idea. Once a novel enters public culture, readers inevitably reinterpret it according to their own historical moment. And of course, this raises an important ethical question. Can every reinterpretation legitimately claim to represent Austen? Elizabeth Wright reminds us that fanfiction based on deceased authors necessarily remains a one-sided conversation. Jane Austen cannot approve or reject the countless reinterpretation circulating online today. There is therefore always a tension between creative fandom and historical fidelity. Yet perhaps that tension is precisely what makes fanfiction intellectually interesting. It asks us to reconsider a question that literary studies has debated for decades. Who owns a story? Does it belong exclusively to its author? Or does it gradually become part of the broader cultural conversation sustained by generations of readers? I would agree that Austen's extraordinarily um, digital afterlight suggests the latter. People do not continue writing these stories because the originals are incomplete or inadequate. They just continue writing it because Austen created characters we fell in love with and who still feel alive. So writing fanfiction therefore becomes less an attempt to replace Austen than to spend a little longer in her word. It is above all an act of affection, I think. And yet, writing is only one way in which contemporary readers express that affection. Sometimes they do not write essays, sometimes they do not write stories, sometimes they just simply make each other laugh. And it is to that humor, to memes, TikToks, Tumblrs, and the extraordinary comic imagination of online Austen fandom that I would like to turn now. So, if fanfiction demonstrates that readers continue Austen stories, memes demonstrate something rather different. They show that readers continue Austen's sense of humor. When we think about Jane Austen, we often think first of romance, Darcy's first proposal, Anne Elliot's letter, Emma's finally recognizing her feelings for Mr. Knightley. They have become ironic moments in literary history. Yet reducing Austen to romance risk overlooking one of the defining characteristics of her writing. Jane Austen was extraordinarily funny. Her novels are filled with social embarrassment, irony, exaggerated personalities, awkward conversations, disastrous proposals, and characters who are often completely unaware of how ridiculous they appear. Mr. Collins, for example, or Mrs. Bennet theatrical nerves, sorry. Um, so all of these, with Miss Bates and Sir Eliot's vanity, they continue to provoke laughter more than 2 centuries after they were written. So perhaps this explains why Austen has adapted so naturally to internet humor. The most obvious expression of this phenomenon is the internet meme. The word itself, of course, predates the internet. Richard Dawkins introduced the concept of the meme in The Selfish Gene in 1976, describing a meme as a cultural unit capable of spreading through imitation, much as genes spread through, spread biologically. Although Dawkins was not thinking of humorous images on social media, his definition proved remarkably adaptable to digital culture. More recently, Limor Schiffman has argued that internet memes should not be simply be understood as jokes, rather they constitute a form of communication through which communities express their shared cultural knowledge. So a meme only functions if its audience already understands the reference, and Jane Austen memes operate according to precisely this principle. To understand why an image of Matthew Macfadyen staring silently into the distance has become shorthand for emotional repression, one must already know Pride and Prejudice. Likewise, jokes about Mr. Collins' energy or being the Charlotte Lucas friends of the group depend upon shared familiarity with Austen characters. Memes therefore create what Schiffman describes as a participatory culture. They are not consumed passively but continually recreated, modified, and circulated by communities that share the same literary vocabulary. In this sense, memes perform an expected educational function. They encourage readers to recognize literary references, recall narrative situations, and participate in conversations about canonical text. Rather than replacing reading, memes often reward it, actually. And perhaps one of the most striking examples concerns Mr. Darcy. Few literary characters have undergone such a remarkable digital transformation. Across TikTok, Instagram, Tumblr, Pinterest, Darcy has become the archetype of what internet culture calls the emotionally unavailable man. Countless memes contrasts his disastrous first proposal. Others celebrate his famous influx in the 2005 Jorrits adaptation, transforming a gesture lasting only a few seconds into one of the most recognizable romantic moments in contemporary popular culture. What fascinates me here is not simply the popularity of these memes, but what they reveal about changing interpretations of masculinity. For example, Michael Cramp has argued that Darcy's occupied a paradoxical position within Austen criticism. He simultaneously embodies traditional masculine authority and its critique. His wealth, social stature, reserve initially appear attractive, yet Austen systematically exposes the arrogance accompanying those privileges before allowing Darcy to develop genuine humility. And I think digital culture has amplified this reading because rather than celebrating Darcy as the perfect romantic hero, many memes gently mock him, and his inability to communicate his awkwardness and the spectacularly unsuccessful first proposal, they all become sources of affectionate humor, and the internet just does not simply idealize Darcy, it humanizes him, I think. Of course, memes rarely strive for historical nuance. They exaggerate, they simplify, they compress entire novels into single images with a single caption, like this one. Yet this compression should not automatically be interpreted as superficiality. Linda Hutcheon reminds us that every adaptation involves selection. Adaptation always emphasizes certain elements while minimizing others, and memes simply perform this process at extraordinary speed because rather than retelling Pride and Prejudice, they isolate one emotional truth: embarrassment, miscommunication, social anxiety, romantic tension. These emotional experiences become immediately recognizable because they transcend their historical setting. As Anaïs Goodman has argued in her work on Austen's transmedial afterlives, digital culture does not simply disseminate Austen's novels, it continually recreates them across new media and new audiences. Humor plays a central role in this process because it lowers the threshold of participation. Someone may hesitate before reading a 300 pages novel, but they will happily share a 15 seconds meme. Rather than opposing entertainment and literary appreciation, I think digital humor frequently serves as a gateway into deeper engagement. This observation brings us back to a recurring theme throughout this presentation. Fans do not merely preserve literature, they recreate its meaning through new cultural practices. Sometimes they write stories, sometimes they organize reading groups, and sometimes they simply laugh together. Yet, online fandoms is not limited to reading, writing, or laughing. For many readers, admiration eventually moves beyond the screen altogether. It becomes embodied. People wearing Regency dress, attending balls, sewing historical clothing, recreating Pemberley on Instagram, or traveling across the world to a Jane Austen festival. In other words, they do not simply read Austen, they perform Austen. It is to those performances of literary identity that I would like now to turn. So far, I've explored three ways in which digital communities engage with Jane Austen. They read together, they write new stories, they laugh through together through memes and digital humor. Yet, online fandom does not remain confined to screens. For many readers, engagement with Austen eventually becomes physical. It moves beyond interpretation and enters everyday life. Fans begin sewing Regency gowns, learning historical dances, collecting beautifully illustrated illustrations and editions, recreating scenes from film adaptations, etc., traveling to literary festivals. This notion of performance is central to understanding contemporary fandoms because while reading and writing are often imagined as intellectual activities, performances make literary appreciation visible. It trends from private admiration to public identity, and one of the most influential thinkers on performance is, of course, Judith Butler, even though she was working on genres. So, although their theory of performativity concerns gender rather than literary fandom, her broader insight that identities are continuously produced through repeated acts rather than simply possessed offers an intriguing lens through which to examine fan practices. So, for example, Jane Austen's fan practices, they are not performing Regency identities in the sense of pretending to belong to the 19th century, but rather they are performing their identity as readers. Through clothing, photography, historical dances, or social media content, they repeatedly communicate their attachment to Austen's fictional universe. Their admiration becomes something that can be seen, recognized, and shared. In the presentation of self in everyday life, Erving Goffman argues that social media resemble theatrical performance because individuals continually present a version of themselves depending on their audience and social context. Digital platforms intensify this process. Instagram, TikTok, and Pinterest encourage users to create and to create highly aesthetic versions of their interests and identities. Austen fandom fit remarkably well within this framework, because a quick search for Jane Austen or Regency aesthetic on Instagram or Pinterest reveals thousands of carefully composed photographs. Readers wearing Empire West dresses while reading Persuasion in gardens, elaborate afternoon teas, inspired by Emma, or shelves decorated with antique decorations, handwritten letters, etc. At first glance, these images appear simply beautiful, yet they perform important cultural work. They transform literary appreciation into a visible identity. Sharing these photographs signals membership within a community that immediately recognizes the references. The images communicate not merely I like Jane Austen, but rather I belong to a community that values this literary word. And this process reflects what Matt Hills described as fan identities. In fan cultures, they argue that fandom should not be understood merely as conception, but as an ongoing performance of cultural belonging, because fans continually negotiate and display their expertise, as we mentioned before, their emotional investment and their commitment to particular text. And therefore, identities is produced collectively through repeated cultural practices. There is also the phenomenon of, regency-balls and Jane Austen festivals across Britain, North America, Australia, and now France. Perhaps the best known example is the Jane Austen Festival in Bath every September. They welcome participants from across the world who attend lectures and theatrical performances, etc. And what's particularly striking is the diversity of those attending. Historians mingle with academics, just devoted readers, or professional customers, or dancers, or tourists, etc. John Wiltshire has noted that such festivals occupy an interesting position between historical education and imaginative recreation. They undoubtedly contribute to preserving Austen's cultural legacy, yet they also risk encouraging what he describes as a romanticized version of the Regency period, one in which elegant gowns and ballroom dancing can sometimes overshadow the social inequalities, economic precarity, and gender constraints that Austen herself so sharply criticized. This tension is worth acknowledging because it reminds us that fandom is never ideologically neutral. The Regency aesthetic currently flourishes across social media and often presents a soft and idealized version of Austen's world, with libraries and dresses and handwritten letters and picnics, etc. But and it contributes to what readers and fans call cottagecore or Regency core. I keep doing that, sorry. These aesthetics undoubtedly attract new readers too, but yet they also invite an important question: which Regency are we celebrating? Is it the historical Regency that Austen inhabited, marked by rigid class hierarchies, limited opportunities for women, etc.? Or is it the carefully curated aesthetics inspired by adaptation, modern history? And perhaps surprisingly, many fans are fully aware of this distinction. Far from confusing fiction with history, they actively discuss the questions online. Historical customers routinely critique inaccurate costumes in film adaptations. Booktubers compare the realities of Regency inheritance law with the representation on screen, etc., etc. And it's the same on TikTok and Reddit, etc. So by this point, we've seen readers interpret Austen, rewrite Austen, laugh with Austen, and embody Austen. The final question, therefore, becomes the most important one of all. What do all these practices tell us about the survival of literary classics in the 21st century? Why has Austen, more than 2 centuries after her death, become not simply an author who is read, but an author who continues to generate new communities, new conversations, and new cultural practices? It's with that question that I would now like to conclude. We've shown now that Jane Austen is not simply being remembered, she's continually being recreated, and this distinction, I believe, is essential, because when we describe an author as classic, we often imagine preservation. We picture books carefully protected in libraries, taught in schools, edited by scholars, etc. The underlying assumption is that cultural survival depends upon stability. Yet, Austen's digital afterlife suggests precisely the opposite. Her novels have survived because they have never remained entirely stable. Every generation has interpreted Austen differently. Victorian readers admired her morality, 20th century critics celebrated her narrative technique, and feminist scholars explored the representations of women agency. Digital fandom represents the latest stage of this ongoing process of reinterpretation. Rather than preserving Austen unchanged, online communities continually ask what her novels can still mean today. This process can be understood through the work of Linda Hutcheon in A Theory of Adaptation. Hutcheon argues that the adaptation should not be viewed as secondary or derivative. Instead, she famously defines adaptation as repetition without replication. Every adaptation simultaneously repeats an existing story while producing something new. And the question is no longer whether fanfiction memes or TikToks remains perfectly faithful to Austen. Instead, we might ask a different question. That would be, what aspect of Austen do these communities choose to preserve? And what aspect do they transform? What do they keep? And also why? Another perspective emerges from the work of Jan and Aleida Assmann on cultural memory. They argue that societies preserve certain texts because they continually reinterpret them according to changing historical circumstances. Cultural memory, therefore, depends not simply upon conservation but upon active reuse. Austen provides an excellent illustration of this principle. The novels have not remained culturally significant because readers have preserved them behind glass, but they have remained significant because successive generations have continually found new reason to read them. So perhaps the most remarkable aspect of history is that it refuses closure. Jane Austen continues generating conversations that she could never have anticipated. The novels remains unfinished, but not because Austen failed to complete them, but more because readers continue extending them through their own imaginations. I would therefore like to return to the question with which I began this presentation. Would Jane Austen have a TikTok account? We cannot know. Perhaps she would have disliked social media entirely. Perhaps she would have observed it with the same amused irony that characterizes her novels. But I think there is another question that matters more. Would Jane Austen have been fascinated by watching readers discuss her work, reinterpret her characters, argue over Mr. Darcy, invent stories inspired by her novels? I like to think she might have been. Because after all, Jane Austen spent her life observing conversations, and that's precisely what online fandom has become. One enormous conversation, and ultimately, I do not believe that Jane Austen survives despite the internet, nor do I believe that the internet has somehow rescued her from obscurity. Rather, digital culture has revealed something that has always been true. Great literature is never finished. It continues to live because readers continues returning to it, questioning it, transforming it, sharing it with others. Every Reddit discussion, every book talk recommendation, every AO3 or Wattpad story, every meme, every historical costume, every Jane Austen festival represents another act of reading, another conversation, another interpretation. It's another reminder that literary classics endure not because they remain untouched, but because every generation insists on making them its own. Perhaps this is the greatest lesson that online fandom offers literary scholars. It reminds us that reading has never been a passive act. It's perhaps, and it has always been, a profoundly creative one. I hope this presentation has shown that Jane Austen's presence online is far more than a passing trend or a collection of amusing memes. It reflects the remarkable ability of great literature to inspire conversation, creativity, community across centuries, cultures, and platforms. Whether we encountered Austen in a university classroom or the shelves on a bookshop, or through book talk recommendation, we're all participating in the same ongoing dialogue with her work. And I think that's perhaps one of the greatest privileges of being an Austen reader today. We're not simply narrating her novels, we are helping to shape their future. Thank you very much. I'd be delighted to answer any of your questions.